What you are about to hear is a chilling tale of trust betrayed, a story that spirals from a simple dispute into a vortex of unimaginable violence. It's a stark reminder that the most monstrous evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of faces. We delve deep into the heart of a case that shocked a community to its core, a story of a bright young student and the man who held her life in his hands, only to shatter it. This is a journey into darkness, a meticulous reconstruction of events, and a testament to the tireless pursuit of justice. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on our in-depth investigations into the cases that matter. Now, prepare yourselves as we unravel the horrifying story of a landlord, his tenant, and a crime that will haunt you long after the screen goes dark. The city of Oakhaven was a picture of serene academia, its ancient university spires piercing the often gray sky, a testament to centuries of knowledge and youthful ambition. For 21-year-old Amelia Amy Tran, it was the culmination of a lifelong dream. The daughter of Vietnamese immigrants who had poured their life savings and relentless hope into her education, Amy was a scholarship student in her final year of a demanding architecture program. She was brilliant, her mind a vibrant landscape of blueprints and innovative designs, her hands constantly sketching, her spirit a quiet but fierce flame of determination. She saw the world in lines and angles, in the interplay of light and shadow, and she was on the cusp of shaping it herself. Her life, however, was a meticulously balanced equation of lectures, late-night study sessions at the university library, and a part-time job at a local coffee shop that smelled perpetually of roasted beans and burnt sugar. Her world was small, but it was hers, and it was filled with the promise of a future she was meticulously constructing, one blueprint at a time. The final piece of this carefully curated life was her small, top-floor apartment in a slightly run-down but charming Victorian house, a respectable, but not too distant, 20-minute walk from the university campus. It was her sanctuary, her creative space, the one place where the pressures of her demanding course load seemed to recede, replaced by the quiet hum of her own thoughts. The rent was a stretch, a constant source of low-grade anxiety, but the large, north-facing window that flooded her drafting table with perfect, indirect light made it worth every penny she scrimped and saved. The house was owned by Mr. Albert Cromwell, a man who, at first glance, seemed to be a perfect caricature of a benevolent, slightly eccentric landlord. In his late 50s, with a paunch that spoke of a fondness for ale and a full head of surprisingly dark, slicked-back hair, he presented an air of old-world charm. He had a booming laugh that he employed frequently and a habit of patting tenants on the back with a little too much force. He lived on the ground floor, a self-proclaimed guardian of the property, a man who took a personal, almost paternal, interest in his tenants, most of whom were students like Amy. He would often be found pottering in the small, overgrown front garden, dispensing unsolicited advice on everything from cooking to relationships. The other tenants, a mix of undergraduates and postgraduates, considered him a harmless, if slightly overbearing, fixture of the house. He was just Mr. Cromwell, a man who seemed to belong to a bygone era, a relic in the fast-paced world of academia. Amy's initial interactions with him had been pleasant enough. He had been effusive in his praise of her portfolio when she'd applied for the apartment, calling her a true artist and a credit to the university. He had even waived the last month's rent as a deposit, a gesture of goodwill that had touched Amy deeply, easing the significant financial burden of her final year. She saw him as a kind, if lonely, old man, someone who took pride in providing a home for the next generation of thinkers and creators. She would smile and nod as he recounted a long, rambling story about his youth or the history of the house, accepting his offers of a cup of tea, which she rarely had time to drink. She was, by nature, a placid and non-confrontational person, her focus so intensely fixed on her studies that she had little energy for anything else. The first subtle shift in their dynamic, the first discordant note in the symphony of her carefully constructed life, came a few months into her tenancy. It was a Tuesday evening, and Amy was hunched over her drafting table, the soft glow of her lamp illuminating a complex blueprint for her final project, a sustainable urban housing complex. She was in the zone, that elusive state of creative flow where the outside world melts away, leaving only the purity of the work. A sharp, insistent rap on her door shattered her concentration. It was Mr. Cromwell, a wide, almost predatory, grin plastered on his face. He held a small, wilting bouquet of carnations in his hand. "A little something to brighten up the room for my star tenant," he boomed, his voice seeming to fill the small apartment. Amy, taken aback, stammered her thanks, accepting the flowers. He lingered at the doorway, his eyes scanning her apartment, his gaze lingering a moment too long on her bed, a simple mattress on the floor in the corner of the room. He made a comment about how a pretty young thing like you must have a lot of suitors, a comment that made a knot of discomfort tighten in her stomach. She mumbled something non-committal, her eyes darting towards her blueprints, a silent plea for him to leave. He finally did, with a final, booming laugh that echoed in the hallway. The incident was small, easily dismissed as the clumsy attempt at friendliness from a lonely old man. But it had unsettled her. It was the first time she had felt a prickle of unease in his presence, the first time his paternal act had felt. She threw the carnations away the next morning, the cloying sweetness of their scent now seeming to mock her. The visits became more frequent after that. He would find excuses to knock on her door, a leaky faucet that he insisted on fixing himself, a new light bulb for the hallway that he just had to show her, a piece of mail that had been mistakenly delivered to his apartment. Each time, he would linger, his conversation becoming more personal, more probing. He asked about her family, her friends, her love life. He would compliment her appearance, his words coated in a syrupy sweetness that made her skin crawl. She started to dread the sound of his heavy footsteps in the hallway, the sharp rap of his knuckles on her door. She took to wearing headphones, even when she wasn't listening to music, hoping the sight of them would deter him. Didn't. The turning point, the moment when unease curdled into genuine fear, came about a month before the final, horrific confrontation. The heating in the old Victorian house was notoriously unreliable, and on a particularly cold November evening, it had given up completely. Amy, wrapped in a thick blanket, was shivering at her desk, her fingers too numb to hold a pencil steady. She reluctantly went downstairs to report the issue to Mr. Cromwell. He opened the door with a flourish, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The smell of whiskey hung heavy in the air. He insisted she come in, that they discuss the matter over a drink. She refused politely, staying firmly in the doorway, explaining the problem with the heating. He dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "The old girl just needs a little TLC," he slurred, his eyes a little unfocused. "I'll take a look at it in the morning." He then reached out, his hand surprisingly quick, and stroked her hair. "Such beautiful hair," he murmured, his voice thick with something she didn't want to name. "Like spun silk." Amy flinched back as if she'd been burned, a gasp escaping her lips. The air crackled with a sudden, terrifying tension. His jovial mask slipped, and for a fleeting second, she saw something else in his eyes, something cold and possessive. He seemed to realize he had overstepped, and the mask was quickly back in place. He chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Just admiring," he said, taking a step back. "No harm in that, is there?" She fled back to her apartment, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cold was forgotten, replaced by a chilling fear that had seeped into her bones. She locked her door, something she had rarely done before, and wedged a chair under the handle. She didn't sleep that night, every creak of the old house sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her system. The next day, the heating was working again. There was a note slipped under her door, written in Mr. Cromwell's looping, overly ornate script. "All fixed, my dear. Anything for my favorite tenant." The note was meant to be reassuring, but to Amy, it felt like a threat, a reminder of his power, of his access to her life, to her home. From that day on, Amy lived in a state of constant low-grade fear. She avoided him as much as possible, altering her schedule to ensure she left the house when he was likely to be out and returning late at night. She stopped going to the communal laundry room in the basement, opting instead for the more expensive laundromat several blocks away. She ate her meals in the university library, unwilling to risk running into him in the shared kitchen. The apartment, her sanctuary, had become a cage. The north-facing window, once a source of joy, now felt like a giant, unblinking eye, and she took to keeping the curtains drawn. She considered moving, but the thought was overwhelming. She had no money for a new deposit, and the thought of trying to find another apartment in the middle of her final exams was a nightmare. Besides, what would she tell the other tenants? That Mr. Cromwell made her uncomfortable? That he had touched her hair? Sounded so trivial, so easily dismissed. She could already hear their responses, their reassurances that he was harmless, that she was overreacting. She was a quiet, private person, not one to make a fuss. So, she said nothing. She retreated further into herself, her world shrinking to the confines of the university and her locked apartment. Her friends noticed the change in her, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched at loud noises. She brushed off their concerns, blaming it on the stress of her final project. She was ashamed of her fear, ashamed of her inability to handle the situation. She was a strong, independent woman, and yet she was being terrorized by her landlord. The final confrontation was precipitated by something as mundane as the rent. It was the first of the month, and Amy was short. A sudden, unexpected expense, a vital piece of software for her final project, had needed a costly upgrade, had left her with a significant shortfall. She had spent the entire night agonizing over it, her stomach in knots. She knew she had to face him, to ask for an extension. The thought filled her with a cold dread. She waited until she heard him moving around in his apartment in the morning, then took a deep breath and went downstairs. She knocked on his door, her knuckles trembling. He opened it almost immediately, a wide, welcoming smile on his face. He was dressed in a stained bathrobe, his hair uncombed. "Amelia, my dear, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Her voice was barely a whisper as she explained her situation, her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. She offered to pay the late fees, to work out a payment plan. She just needed a little more time. He listened patiently, his smile never wavering. When she had finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, his voice soft, almost a purr, "Of course, my dear, we can work something out." He opened the door wider. "Come in. Let's have a cup of tea and discuss it." Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to turn and flee up the stairs and lock her door. But she was trapped. She needed this extension. She couldn't afford to antagonize him. So, with a sense of grim resignation, a feeling of stepping off a cliff into a dark, unknown abyss, she stepped into his apartment. The air inside was thick and cloying, a mixture of stale whiskey, dust, and something else, something vaguely unpleasant she couldn't quite identify. The room was cluttered with old furniture, stacks of yellowing newspapers, and an unnerving collection of porcelain dolls, their glass eyes seeming to follow her every move. He gestured to a worn, threadbare armchair. "Have a seat, my dear. Make yourself comfortable." She perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clenched in her lap. He disappeared into the kitchen, and she could hear him humming a jaunty, off-key tune. The sound grated on her already frayed nerves. She looked around the room, a feeling of deep unease settling over her. The place felt wrong. It was the apartment of a man who lived entirely in the past, a man whose world had shrunk to these four cluttered walls. He returned with a tray, a chipped teapot, and two mismatched cups. He poured the tea, his hands surprisingly steady. He sat down opposite her, in a large, imposing armchair that seemed to swallow him whole. He took a long, slow sip of his tea, his eyes fixed on her over the rim of the cup. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, he spoke. "So, a little bit of a cash flow problem, eh? It happens to the best of us." He leaned forward, a conspiratorial smile on his face. "Tell you what, I'm a reasonable man. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement." The way he said the word arrangement, the slight emphasis, the gleam in his eyes, sent a shiver of pure ice down her spine. The unspoken implication hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. This wasn't about the rent anymore. It had never been about the rent. Her voice, when she finally found it, was stronger than she expected. "What kind of arrangement?" He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Oh, I think you know, my dear. Pretty girl like you, a man like me, we can be of mutual benefit to each other." The blood drained from her face. The vague unease, the low-grade fear she had been living with for months, had now coalesced into a single, terrifying certainty. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. I have to go," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I'll get you the money. I just need a few days." She turned to leave, but he was faster than she could have imagined. He was suddenly in front of her, blocking her path to the door. The jovial mask was gone completely now, replaced by a look of raw, naked hunger. His eyes, which she had once thought of as twinkling, were now cold and hard, like chips of flint. "Not so fast, my dear," he said, his voice a low growl. "We haven't finished our conversation." He reached for her. The assault was brutal, sudden, and terrifyingly swift. Amy, small and slender, was no match for his bulk and surprising strength. Her screams were muffled by the thick, cluttered walls of his apartment, her struggles futile against his iron grip. The world, which she had so carefully constructed, so meticulously planned, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The gathering storm had finally broken, and in its devastating wake, it would leave a trail of unimaginable horror. The world swam back into focus for Amy in fragmented, nightmarish shards. The first thing she was aware of was the pain, a searing, all-encompassing agony that seemed to emanate from every nerve ending in her body. The second was the cloying, sickly sweet smell of cheap whiskey and stale sweat, a smell that would forever be seared into her memory. She was on the floor, the rough, threadbare carpet scratching against her cheek. Above her, Mr. Cromwell was a hulking, shadowy figure, his breathing heavy and labored, a grotesque parody of a lover's exertion. The porcelain dolls on the mantelpiece seemed to watch her with their cold, glass eyes, silent, indifferent witnesses to her violation. A wave of nausea and revulsion washed over her, so powerful it almost made her black out again. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single silent tear tracing a path through the grime on her face. In that moment, a profound and terrifying shift occurred within her. The fear, the shame, the helplessness that had paralyzed her for months was burned away in the crucible of this ultimate violation, replaced by a white-hot, all-consuming rage. It was a rage born of a deep, primal instinct for survival, a rage that gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She lay still for a moment, forcing her breathing to even out, her mind working with a desperate, chilling clarity. He was fumbling with his clothes, his back partially turned to her. It was her only chance. With a guttural scream that was more animal than human, she launched herself at him, her fingers clawing at his face, her teeth sinking into the soft flesh of his shoulder. He roared in pain and surprise, stumbling backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. For a fleeting second, the tables had turned. She was the aggressor, he the victim, but the moment was short-lived. His surprise quickly morphed into a fury that was even more terrifying than his earlier lust. He backhanded her across the face, the force of the blow sending her sprawling, her head cracking against the leg of a heavy wooden table. The world exploded in a supernova of white-hot pain, and then, mercifully, there was only darkness. When Cromwell looked down at the still, silent figure on his floor, a flicker of something akin to panic pierced the red haze of his rage. The girl wasn't moving. A thin trickle of blood was seeping from a wound on her temple, a stark, crimson river against the pale landscape of her skin. He reached down, his hand trembling slightly, and felt for a pulse. There was nothing, just the cold, unresponsive stillness of death. The reality of what he had done crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. He had crossed a line he had been circling his entire life, a line he had always managed to dance back from. But not this time. This time he had stumbled and fallen into the abyss. He was a murderer. The word echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of the room. His first instinct was to call the police, to confess, to throw himself at the mercy of the law. But that instinct was quickly squashed by a more powerful one: self-preservation. He was not a man who was accustomed to consequences. He was a man who had always managed to get what he wanted, a man who saw other people as objects, as tools to be used for his own gratification. The thought of prison, of the loss of his freedom, of the public humiliation, was unbearable. He had to fix this. He had to make it go away. His mind, which had been a maelstrom of rage and lust just moments before, was now a cold, calculating machine. He began to pace the room, his bare feet silent on the worn carpet, his brain working furiously. He had to get rid of the body. That was the first, most crucial step. He looked around the cluttered apartment, his eyes darting from one object to another. He needed something to wrap her in, something to transport her in. His gaze fell on a large, heavy-duty tarpaulin he kept in a closet, a relic from a long-abandoned sailing hobby. It would have to do. He worked with a grim, methodical efficiency, his earlier panic now replaced by a chilling, detached focus. He was a man with a problem to solve, and he would solve it no matter the cost. He wrapped Amy's small, broken body in the tarpaulin, the rough, synthetic material a final, obscene shroud. He secured it with a length of rope, his knots firm and precise. He was surprisingly strong, and he managed to hoist the grim bundle onto his shoulder. It was heavier than he had expected. The next problem was getting the body out of the house undetected. He couldn't risk going out the front door. The other tenants, the nosy postgraduate student in the apartment next to Amy's, the young couple on the second floor, they were a liability. But he had another way out, a way that no one else knew about. There was a cellar, accessible from a hidden door in his kitchen, a relic from the days when the house had been a single-family dwelling. The cellar had a small, street-level door at the back of the house, a door that was used for coal delivery in a bygone era. It was almost completely obscured by a thick, overgrown hedge. It was the perfect escape route. He half-dragged, half-carried his terrible burden into the kitchen and down the steep, stone steps into the cellar. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of earth and decay. He fumbled for the light switch, a single, bare bulb flickering to life, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. He laid the body down on the cold, damp floor and went back upstairs to retrieve his car keys. His car, a large old station wagon with a cavernous trunk, was parked in the alleyway behind the house. He drove it to the back of the property, the engine a low, guttural rumble in the pre-dawn quiet. He opened the cellar door, a cloud of dust and dead leaves billowing out. The most difficult part was getting the body from the cellar into the trunk of the car. It was an awkward, gruesome task, a clumsy, macabre dance with the dead. He grunted and strained, his muscles screaming in protest. Finally, with a final, desperate heave, the body was in the trunk. He slammed it shut, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. He drove aimlessly at first, his mind a blank slate of shock and adrenaline. He needed a place to dump the body, a place where it wouldn't be found, not for a long time at least. He drove out of the city, the familiar streets and landmarks of Oakhaven seeming to mock him with their normality. How could the world look so ordinary when he had committed such an extraordinary act of violence? He found himself on a deserted country road, the river, a dark, malevolent ribbon of black water, flowing silently beside it. The Oakhaven River, a popular spot for kayakers and picnickers in the summer, was a different entity in the cold, pre-dawn light of a late autumn morning. It was a place of secrets, a place that could swallow evidence and never give it back. He pulled over at a spot where the road ran close to the riverbank, a spot that was shielded from view by a thick stand of trees. He got out of the car, the cold air a shock to his system. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the muddy bank. He opened the trunk and, with a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he dragged the body out of the car and to the water's edge. The tarpaulin was heavy, a dead weight that seemed to fight him every step of the way. He pushed it into the water, and it landed with a sickening splash, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. It floated for a moment, a dark, obscene shape on the surface of the water, and then, slowly, it began to sink. He watched until it was completely gone, swallowed by the dark, cold depths of the river. He stood there for a long time, his breathing ragged, his body trembling. It was done. He had made it go away. He drove back to the city, the first hints of dawn beginning to streak the eastern sky. He parked the car in its usual spot, went back into his apartment, and poured himself a large glass of whiskey. He drank it in one go, the fiery liquid doing little to quell the tremor in his hands. The next few days passed in a blur of alcohol and paranoia. He scrubbed his apartment with a frantic, obsessive energy, using bleach and industrial-strength cleaners to obliterate any trace of what had happened. He burned the clothes he had been wearing, the acrid smell of burning fabric filling the air. He rehearsed his story, his alibi, over and over again in his mind. Amy had come to him, upset about her rent. He had agreed to give her an extension. She had left, and he hadn't seen her since. She was a troubled girl, he would say, prone to fits of melodrama. She had probably just run off, unable to cope with the pressure of her final exams. It was a plausible story, a story that he repeated to himself until it almost felt true. He even managed to maintain his facade of the benevolent, harmless landlord. He greeted the other tenants with his usual booming laugh, his usual backslapping bonhomie. But underneath the mask, he was a man in turmoil. He was haunted by what he had done, by the image of Amy's still, silent face, by the sickening splash of her body hitting the water. He started drinking heavily, the whiskey his only solace, his only escape from the prison of his own making. The first sign that his carefully constructed world was about to unravel came a few days later, in the form of a tentative knock on his door. It was Amy's friend, a bright, bubbly girl named Chloe, her face etched with worry. "Have you seen Amy?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "She's not answering her phone, and she hasn't been to any of her classes. I'm really starting to worry." Cromwell put on his most concerned, paternal expression. He told her his well-rehearsed story, his voice oozing with false sympathy. He offered her a cup of tea, which she refused. He watched her walk away, a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. The questions were starting. It was only a matter of time before they came for him. The descent into darkness was complete. He was no longer just a murderer. He was a man living on borrowed time, a man waiting for the inevitable knock on the door that would signal the end of his world. Detective Inspector James "Jim" Corrigan was a man who had seen the worst of humanity. A 20-year veteran of the Oak Haven police force, he had a weary, cynical air about him, a man who had long since lost any illusions about the inherent goodness of mankind. He was a meticulous, patient investigator, a man who believed that every criminal, no matter how clever, eventually made a mistake. It was his job to find that mistake, to pull on that loose thread until the entire, carefully woven tapestry of their lies unraveled. The case of the missing student, Amelia Tran, landed on his desk on a cold, gray Monday morning. At first, it was just another missing persons report, one of dozens that crossed his desk every year. Young people, especially students, often went off the grid for a few days, a weekend trip they had forgotten to tell their friends about, a bout of exam-induced anxiety that made them retreat from the world. But there was something about this case that pricked at Corrigan's well-honed intuition. The girl's friend, Chloe, was adamant that Amy was not the type to just disappear. She was responsible, dedicated, on the cusp of graduating with honors. It was out of character, a discordant note in the symphony of a well-ordered life. Corrigan and his partner, a young, eager detective named Sarah Jenkins, started their investigation at the most logical place, Amy's apartment. The landlord, a man named Albert Cromwell, let them in, his face a mask of concern and paternal worry. He was, Corrigan noted, a little too eager to help, a little too effusive in his praise of his star tenant. He told them the story he had told Chloe, The story about the rent, the extension, the troubled young woman who had just walked away from it all. Corrigan listened patiently, his face impassive, his eyes taking in every detail of the man's demeanor, the slight sheen of sweat on his upper lip, the way his eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting his. Amy's apartment was neat and tidy, almost sterile. Her drafting table was covered with a half-finished blueprint, her pencils and pens arranged in a neat, orderly row. Her bed was made, her clothes were folded in her closet. It was not the room of a person who had planned to leave. It was the room of a person who had every intention of coming back. Corrigan and Jenkins interviewed the other tenants. They all painted the same picture of Cromwell. A harmless, if slightly overbearing, old man. They all spoke of Amy as a quiet, studious girl who kept to herself. But one of the tenants, a postgraduate student who lived in the apartment next to Amy's, mentioned something that piqued Corrigan's interest. He had heard a noise on the morning Amy disappeared, a loud thud, like something heavy being dropped. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but in retrospect it seemed. The first real break in the case came from the most mundane of sources, the university's security cameras. Corrigan and Jenkins spent hours poring over the footage from the days leading up to Amy's disappearance. They saw her coming and going from the library, from the coffee shop where she worked, her movements as regular and predictable as a clock. And then, on the morning she disappeared, they saw something else. They saw Cromwell's car, the old, battered station wagon, leaving the alleyway behind the house at an unusually early hour, just before dawn. It was a small detail, a tiny crack in Cromwell's carefully constructed alibi. The next step was to track the car's movements. Oakhaven, like most modern cities, had a network of traffic cameras. It was a painstaking, tedious process, but after 2 days of non-stop work, they had a hit. A traffic camera on a deserted country road on the outskirts of the city had captured Cromwell's car pulling over by the Oakhaven River. The timestamp on the footage was from the morning Amy had disappeared. Corrigan felt a cold knot of certainty form in the pit of his stomach. He knew, with a grim, sickening finality, what had happened to Amelia Tran. He organized a search of the river, a team of diverse, methodically scouring the cold, murky depths. Took them less than a day to find her. The body, wrapped in a heavy-duty tarpaulin, was pulled from the water, a grim, silent testament to the horrors that had befallen its owner. The autopsy confirmed Corrigan's worst fears. Amy had been sexually assaulted and had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The evidence was now overwhelming, a tidal wave that was about to crash down on Albert Cromwell. They arrested him at his apartment. He didn't resist, his face a mask of shocked disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that his world was finally, irrevocably, coming to an end. The jovial, back-slapping landlord was gone, replaced by a trembling, terrified old man. The interrogation was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Corrigan was patient, methodical, his voice a calm, steady drone as he laid out the evidence, piece by piece. The security camera footage of his car, the traffic camera by the river, the testimony of the neighbor who had heard the thud. He watched as Cromwell's composure began to crumble, as the sweat beaded on his forehead, as the color drained from his face. The final, damning piece of evidence came from the forensic team. They had found traces of Amy's blood and hair in the trunk of Cromwell's car and on the carpet in his apartment. They had also found traces of Cromwell's DNA on Amy's body. The net had closed. There was no escape. Cromwell, faced with the irrefutable scientific certainty of his guilt, finally broke. The dam of his lies burst, and the confession came pouring out, a torrent of self-pity, excuses, and half-truths. He tried to paint himself as the victim, a lonely old man who had been driven to a moment of madness by a tease of a girl. He claimed it was an accident, that he had never meant to kill her. Corrigan listened to the pathetic, self-serving monologue with a cold, professional detachment. He had heard it all before, the endless litany of excuses that men like Cromwell used to justify their monstrous acts. He was not a victim. He was a predator, a man who had hidden his true nature behind a mask of harmless eccentricity, a man who had preyed on the vulnerability of a young woman who had trusted him. The trial was a media sensation. The story of the landlord from hell splashed across the front pages of every newspaper. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous indignation. Chloe, Amy's friend, testified. Her voice choked with tears as she spoke of the bright, talented young woman whose life had been so brutally cut short. The postgraduate student who had heard the thud testified, his voice barely a whisper. The divers who had pulled Amy's body from the river testified, their faces grim and impassive. Cromwell sat at the defendant's table, a shrunken, pathetic figure, his eyes downcast, his face a mask of sullen indifference. He never once looked at Amy's parents, who sat in the front row of the gallery, their faces a portrait of unimaginable grief. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. Guilty, on all counts, murder, rape, kidnapping. The judge, his voice filled with a cold, righteous anger, sentenced him to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. He would die behind bars, a fitting end for a man who had taken so much, a man who had left a trail of devastation and heartbreak in his wake. Justice had been served, but it was a cold, hollow victory.